It's a big challenge. We know we've got all these different aspects, if you like, that we need to balance across land use in terms of food production, biodiversity, water quality, climate change mitigation, lots of other things. So I have the luxury of working in academia, so we can kind of step back. We're not responsible for anything, so we can look at scientific papers and we can form conclusions. So what I've tried to do here is step back a little bit and try and look a little bit more for the longer term. What could it mean in Ireland to have a sustainable and resilient agriculture and land use sector? Because we get caught up in a lot of debate about what we need to do next for our carbon budgets or for water quality. But we don't have much of a vision about what the end zone, what is sustainable, what is resilient, and that's something I'd like to talk about a little bit now. And thanks very much for the invitation to be here. So why vision, firstly? And predicting the future is a mug's game. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow, yet alone 10 years down the line or 20 years down the line. But having said that, we know we're in a time of change. We've seen immense volatility the last few years. That's going to continue. Climate change is going to manifest massive pressures on us all. So it's very difficult to plan in that context, and that's where strategic foresight is seen as a really important tool, something that we can do to try and imagine what the future could look like and how we might respond to those different possibilities. And I think that's really important for the land sector. We don't have all the answers, we don't have all the solutions, but we need to think about where we might need to get to. And so I think this is especially important for farmers, because farmers want to know for themselves and for the next generation that they pass the farms on to, what is it that's going to be successful in the future? What's likely to be resilient to future changes? So that's a little bit what I'd like to talk about today. And we're in this situation because of market failure. The economy is not delivering the action that we need on climate change. We're going in the wrong direction. That's a simple fact. We're not sustainable. And so we need to make ourselves sustainable. We need to change things. That's also a fact. And up to now, we've had a very reactionary approach. We've seen regulations, we've seen that we need to change, we've put a sticking plaster here, a sticking plaster there. It's been done sometimes very willingly and sometimes very grudgingly. But that approach is always going to fail, because we're never going to look at where we need to get to. We're never going to think about what we actually need to do, what's positive about where we could get to, how can we make money in different ways, how can we do things differently. So again, I don't have all the answers, but I'd just like to maybe talk through some of what we found from some recent research. And the first point about this jigsaw puzzle, which probably will never get to fully complete, is that we really need stakeholder buy-in to change, but that is going to require some kind of vision. We can't keep asking people to do things without some kind of vision about where we're going, because people want to know that. Now, the second point I'll make, this is about sustainability. What does sustainability mean? And I've spent almost 20 years now working on carbon footprints, life cycle assessment. Very useful, very good at measuring environmental intensity, environmental efficiency. But low carbon footprints, or comparatively small carbon footprints for milk and beef, which Ireland is well known for, does not translate into sustainability necessarily. It could be an important part of sustainability, but it's important that we recognize that sustainability means a lot more. There are absolute thresholds to sustainability. The planetary boundaries, net zero, which we know we need to meet for climate change, they're absolute thresholds. We can be as efficient as we like, but if we're producing too much, we won't meet those thresholds. We'll be unsustainable, and that's where we are at the moment. So we need to respect the fact that sustainability environmentally is absolute. There are absolute thresholds. And at a national level, that means we need to meet climate targets, net zero by 2050 or thereabouts. And at the catchment level, we need to meet water quality targets. So we have different scales, if you like, for meeting these different objectives. But it's very clear from recent work, and this is the latest paper by Rockstrom et al., that we are categorically exceeding most of our planetary boundaries in terms of sustainability. We are living way beyond our means, if you like, in terms of sustainability. And the food system is a major driver of that globally, because it appropriates most of the land that humans use globally. We have more population overnourished than malnourished. Malnourishment is a massive problem, but there are more people overnourished. We have overconsumption of animal products. We have 30 to 40% of food being wasted. Farmers are running to stand still because they have to produce more at low margins just to make a living. And production and revenues are poorly distributed along value chains and across countries. And retailers strive to sell more every year. That's the reality of the food system. Now, objectively, that doesn't seem sustainable. I think we are going to need to change that food system globally. And Ireland plays a very efficient role, if you like, in that food system, but it is a broken system, and it is going to have to change because of the climate crisis and for other reasons. So we need to think about what could Ireland's role be in the future in that. And now there's increasing talk about resilience, because we know we have to adapt to climate change. And resilience is different from efficiency. And in some ways, it might pull in a very different direction, especially when the future is uncertain. We don't know what we need to be resilient to, but resilience is about having that buffer, being able to respond to changes in prices, changes in demands, changes in regulation, changes in climate. And that mentality of being resilient and being able to adapt and maybe having a portfolio of outputs, a portfolio of land uses to be able to deal with different futures is a very different mentality, very different way of thinking from optimization and from efficiency. And a lot of companies are starting to engage with this a lot more now across all industries, because we know the future is uncertain. So we need to start thinking a lot more about resilience as well as efficiency and optimization and sustainability. So I guess the message is efficiency is very important, but it's only a small part of the big picture, if you like, of where we need to be. And future food, or future agri-food systems, they will have to look very different from what they look now. There's issues like water stress in parts of the world where we import a lot of our horticultural products from. Maybe we need to be more self-sufficient in some of those products. We are very food secure according to many metrics, as Bill said, but we do import a lot of the food that we actually consume, and that could be more problematic in the future than it is now. So coming back to Ireland, Ireland does produce milk and beef comparatively quite efficiently compared with many countries of the world, that's a fact. We have a very productive grass platform, which means it's very efficient at producing milk solids at quite low cost, because we can produce them when the grass is growing at its maximum rates and put it into powder form and export it around the world. Don't rely as much on concentrate feed as other countries might do, or herds in other countries might do, so that's very positive. And agriculture, the agri-food system, does play quite a big role in the national economy. And it's seen us through times which were more difficult when other sectors didn't do so well. So that's all very positive. On the other hand, we still do import a lot of the food that we consume, and the type of agriculture that we specialize in, milk and beef, is an extremely leaky system. That's just an inevitable consequence of the nature, if you like, of the cattle production that we rely upon. So we have this massive problem for climate neutrality, which is what we were looking at in some recent projects. If climate neutrality is about getting to net zero, we need to balance those scales. And at the moment, you can see we've got huge weights on the left-hand side of that scale, 23 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent from agriculture, about 9 million tons from drained organic soils, about 2 million tons from wetlands, exploited wetlands. Now, on the other side, in terms of carbon removals, we've only got about 2 million tons from improved mineral soils, carbon sequestration into those, and now a really strongly declining carbon sink in forestry. It's only 2 million tons of CO2 equivalent per hectare per year, and declining further. So we need to get those scales in balance. We're such a long way from getting those scales in balance, and that's just for the land sector. The land sector probably needs to be a net sink in future to offset residual emissions in other sectors. The scale of this challenge is phenomenal. Like, it's really huge, and I think we need to be honest with farmers about how big that challenge is. We've also got ammonia, 120,000 tons of ammonia. Very difficult to control that from manures, which are stored in tanks and spread on the lands. We've got 87,000 tons approximately of nitrogen leaching, 6.9 thousand tons of phosphorus losses, and we use almost 5 million hectares of land from agriculture, which means we have a very grassland-dominated landscape, very different from what it perhaps used to be thousands of years ago. Those are all things that are going to have to change to meet water quality, air quality, climate change, biodiversity objectives. So continued specialization in leaky food production and expensive abatement to make that a bit cleaner is actually a huge gamble on the future. We know we're going to have a very different food system in the future. So continuing to specialize and to try to be a bit more efficient and to abate a bit more, we do need to do a lot of that, but to do that only and not to think about much, much more ambitious diversification, I think, is hugely risky. So from some work we did recently, we tried to kind of reimagine, if you like. We know the land areas we have, we know the mineral soils, the organic soil areas, we know the areas of forestry, of animal numbers. We tried to randomize what that future could look like in terms of what was possible in Ireland, in terms of animal numbers for dairy herd, for the beef herd, for areas of semi-natural forest, areas of coniferous forest, re-wetting. And we tried to put that together in a random way and think about which of those random scenarios, which of those 3,000 random scenarios could actually be climate neutral. It's kind of objective way, if you like, to think about what's possible. Now, I think what was very clear from that analysis is that even if we're quite optimistic about abatement, even if we assume we can drive down emissions by 30% across nitrous oxide and methane, we still end up with a future where it's simply not possible, even with more generous definitions of climate neutrality, if you like, that mean we don't have to offset all the methane. Even with those assumptions, we can never have a future with all the animals we have now that meets climate neutrality. It's just not possible. And there's a trade-off. Maybe we could keep the dairy herds if we got rid of most of the beef herd or vice versa, but we can't have beef and dairy from specialisation, if you like, at the level that we do now. It's just not possible within climate neutrality bounds. And furthermore, the frontier there, if you like, on the scatter plots, that's, I think, beef up on the y-axis and dairy across on the x-axis. The top right is where we are now. We always have to come down or move left because we always need to reduce dairy or beef numbers to get to climate neutrality across those scenarios that achieve climate neutrality. Now, that frontier, I probably shouldn't move too much. I think I'm supposed to talk into the microphone. That frontier is predicated on extremely ambitious action across rewetting and across forest rates of forest planting, which are way, way in excess of what we achieve now. So unless we get really, really efficient at planting huge numbers of trees and rewetting extremely efficiently, we're not going to get anywhere close to that frontier, and we're going to have to reduce animal numbers a lot more. So there are real decisions there. The more ambitious we are with the rewetting and the tree planting, the more space we have for more animal production, but there's no way we could have the animal production we have now in a climate-neutral, national, kind of climate-neutral future. That's just the way the numbers stack up. And so our land patterns will have to look very different. Now, will these represent different definitions of what climate neutrality might look like? Because that's not agreed, unfortunately. But in all cases, they're very different from the top left, which is the current situation. In all cases, we need a lot more forestry, at least about 500,000 hectares more by 2050. So climate neutrality is going to demand really large-scale land use and land management changes, and a diversification or a change in use of at least 0.8 million hectares if you add up the forestry and the rewetting, and probably a lot more because there's lots of other things we need to do as well. Now, forestry is one of our big levers, if you like, for getting more carbon sinks, more carbon offsets, because we don't have much forestry, and we need a lot more of it to get carbon sinks in place to store carbon and biomass. The positive side about that is that if we manage productive forests, commercial forests, we can actually use that wood in the future. We know we need to do that for climate mitigation as well. We need to reduce concrete use in construction. We can substitute some of that concrete use with wood, lower carbon, but it also stores that carbon that you take out of the forest for a long period of time. The benefit of doing that is that when you eventually come to the end of the life of that wood, which could be 100 years from now, there's a good chance that we could maybe use combustion or gasification technology and take out the CO2 and then bury that CO2 back in the ground, carbon capture and storage. That technology doesn't work now. Well, it does work, but it's not commercial. And the assumption is we're going to need it to work in the future. So forestry, wood products buy us time to get that long-term carbon sink in place, which means that trees we're planting now, potentially some of that carbon could never see the atmosphere again if it goes through this process, and it could generate revenue in the meantime. So that's a very kind of positive, if you like, vision of how commercial forestry could contribute to the economy and to long-term climate mitigation. But we don't necessarily want to plant high productive coniferous forest everywhere. There are negative associations with that for biodiversity, possibly for water quality with clear felling. So we'll need semi-natural woodland as well in the right places, and that's where we have strong benefits with biodiversity, with water quality. And we need to avoid planting on organic soils because of the emissions we get from organic soils when we drain them for forestry. And this is something we need to do for the future, but we need to start thinking about this and doing this now because it takes a long time. You see the curve there, that's a forest planting strategy in the UK, but it takes 20 years for the curve to start ramping up because you've got the rollout of the actual planting and then the slow growth of the trees in the early years. If we don't start doing this now, there's no way we're going to get to neutrality by 2050, or at least we could get to neutrality, but we'd have to lose almost all our animals to get there. So those are the choices we face. If we don't take really dramatic action now to get sinks in place, then there won't be any headroom for animal production in the future. And we are going to rely on a lot of this tree planting to give us that carbon offset into the future. Organic soils, I won't say too much about this. We know we've got large areas that are drained. We know we need to re-wet them. There's uncertainty about emission factors, uncertainty even about area, as Bill said earlier. We don't know exactly where all these organic soils are. But But we need to do as much of that as possible to get those emissions down, because they're kind of dead emissions. They're not very productive emissions. They're taking away allowance from productive parts of the economy, if you like, to emit in the future. So we need to drive those emissions down as far as we can. And that's going to require change management across large areas. That should contribute to better water quality in many of those areas, and also flood risk, flood mitigation, et cetera, as well. Now, something that's quite important in the Climate Action Plan is this expansion of biomethane. And that could have some significant benefits for national fuel security. It could mean we avoid manure management emissions because we're taking that methane, we're trapping it as a gas, we're using it as a fuel. That's all very positive. But it's an excellent waste management technology. If we're using large areas of grassland to go into these systems, there is a big risk there because they generate fugitive emissions of methane, but especially ammonia. We've got very high ammonium NH4 nitrogen in the digestate, very high pH in the digestate. If we don't manage that very carefully, we're going to end up with a lot of ammonia emissions, a lot of nutrient leakage again, which could come back to waters. So we are taking out the animals from the equation, and that's very beneficial from a national climate perspective. We're substituting fossil fuels, again, beneficial, but we do have a lot of nutrient risks unless we manage that digestate very carefully, possibly by upgrading into a kind of pellet biofertilizer or something. We're also probably going to take quite a lot of land to do this, maybe a few 100,000 hectares. That's fine, and it's good, but we're not diversifying that land out of grass. We're keeping it under grass, which is not necessarily good for biodiversity. It doesn't give us a carbon sink, and if we're worried about taking mineral soils for forestry, that's a couple of 100,000 hectares of mineral soils that aren't available for forestry anymore. So we do have to think carefully about how this fits in the bigger picture, if you like. And generally speaking, when we look at these systems, if you can make them into biorefineries that do something else, maybe grass protein extraction and the residual material goes into anaerobic digestion, then you're getting a useful protein that could go into monogastric animal feed or something, or you're getting fertilizers out from the digestate, or you're trying to take the carbon out of the methane to produce hydrogen fuel. Those are the things we probably need to do to make this genuinely kind of environmentally sustainable. So we need to think carefully about how this strategy is configured, if you like, with bigger biorefineries. So again, it's about avoiding incrementalism and thinking to actually be sustainable and resilient in the future, we need quite dramatic changes. So we need to make sure those investments we make are actually future-proofed and will fit within a future sustainable economy. Now, finally, there are lots of other things we could talk about and do for diversification, but it is important to note that there is a big push, if you like, to alternative proteins. And there's a big opportunity here as well as a risk. Most of the value added in the agri-food sector is actually downstream in the processing. It's not the farmers who barely make a living in many cases, especially beef farmers. So there's no reason that Ireland couldn't specialize in alternative proteins and producing plant-based proteins or producing kind of proteins in the lab, and having a very successful food sector, a big exporter potentially, that isn't so land dependent and isn't so cow dependent. Now, maybe that's controversial in some ways to say, but there is a possibility for a very successful food sector in Ireland to build on the expertise that already is here without having to have all the pollution associated with and the huge areas of land required for the animals. So we need to think about some of these things, because these are ways that we can really truly diversify the economy in a way that still makes money but doesn't have all the pollution associated with it. So finally, sorry, I'm a few minutes, 40 seconds over time. Irish agriculture is an efficient cog. It is very efficient at producing meat and milk relative to other parts of the world, but it is doing so in a broken system that's fundamentally unsustainable. So the current agri-food system does need to change. It's not actually good for farmers the way it is now, when many beef farmers don't actually make a living out of producing the animals. They survive off the subsidies and by having a second job. That's not necessarily something to aspire to as a system to protect. Efficiency and abatement measures are very important, but they're insufficient. They won't get us to sustainability. And thinking that they will, relying on them to do so, is a massive gamble on an uncertain future. Climate action is necessarily going to involve diversification of at least 0.8 million hectares, but probably much more, especially when we consider areas needed for biodiversity action. And these actions are likely to realize substantial water, air quality, and resilience co-benefits. We do need some spatial assessment to understand where these changes are likely to happen or should happen for maximum benefit. But it's really important we develop new financing instruments, because farmers are responding to the price signals they get and to the policy support for continuing doing what they're doing. And that needs to change with different financing methods to pay for natural capital for ecosystem services, etc. So I think despite the uncertainties, the direction of travel is clear. We don't have all the ingredients or all the parts of that puzzle to know exactly what the end vision looks like, but we do need to start thinking about it, and there needs to be a dialogue, a more honest dialogue with stakeholders about what that future could look like that's genuinely sustainable and genuinely resilient, because we all need a goal to aim for. Even if it's not completely perfectly defined, having some kind of goal is really important. And farmers are the agents of change for that, but they do require that coherent policy and market framework guided by this strategic long-term vision. So that's it. Thanks for your attention.